In a city where wealth buys invisibility, one man's secrets destroyed a young woman's life, and almost got away with it. This isn't just a story about power, privilege, and betrayal. It's about what happens when silence protects predators. And today, you're going to hear the truth no headline has dared to tell. Dubai, a place where skyscrapers touch the sky and fortunes are made overnight. It's a glittering paradise on the surface, but beneath its polished facade lies a world of shadows. A world where not everyone is equal, no matter how hard they try to rise above. This is the story of Sarah Hassan, a flight attendant who dreamed of a better future for herself and her family. She worked tirelessly, enduring long hours and grueling shifts, all while smiling through the exhaustion because she believed her efforts would pay off. But Sarah didn't know that one encounter, one seemingly harmless meeting aboard a billionaire's private jet, would change everything. His name? Khalid Al-Nasri. A self-made billionaire whose charm hid a darker reality. To the outside world, he was untouchable. Wealthy, powerful, respected. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Something dangerous. What happened between them wasn't just an affair, it was a collision of two worlds that should never have met. And by the time Sarah realized the cost of crossing paths with Khalid, it was already too late. Stay with me as we uncover the shocking details of this tragedy, the kind of story headlines only scratch the surface of. Because this isn't just about Sarah or Khalid, it's about the systems that protect the powerful and the courage it takes to fight back. Don't forget to subscribe, because once you hear what really happened, you won't look at stories like this the same way again. Let's dive deeper, together. At first glance, it seemed almost ordinary. Khalid Al-Nasri wasn't the kind of man who announced his presence with fireworks or fanfare. No, he was subtler than that. He had a way of making people feel noticed, important, even cherished. And for Sarah Hassan, that attention felt intoxicating. It wasn't just the luxury surrounding him, the private jets, the designer suits, the effortless confidence. It was the way he looked at her, like she mattered more than anyone else in the room. For someone who spent her days serving passengers and blending into the background, that kind of focus was hard to resist. It started small, as these things often do. A compliment here, a lingering conversation there. On one of those early flights, Khalid leaned closer as Sarah served him coffee, his voice low but warm. "You have a gift," he said, his tone smooth and deliberate. "Not everyone can make work look so effortless." Sarah laughed it off, brushing it aside as polite flattery, but inside, something stirred. It wasn't every day someone like him paid attention to someone like her. The next time they crossed paths, it wasn't by chance, or at least, that's what Khalid wanted her to believe. He booked a seat on her route again, this time upgrading to first class without hesitation. When their eyes met, he smiled knowingly, as if sharing a secret only they understood. By the end of the flight, he'd invited her to dinner at an exclusive restaurant downtown. "Just dinner," he assured her when she hesitated. "No strings attached." But there were always strings. You just couldn't see them right away. For Sarah, the allure was undeniable. Here was a man opening doors she'd never dreamed of walking through. Dinner turned into late-night conversations, which turned into private outings at places most people only saw in magazines. Khalid showered her with gifts, a designer handbag here, a weekend getaway there, all while spinning promises of adventure and excitement. To Sarah, it felt like stepping into a world she'd only seen from afar. For once, she wasn't just watching, she was living it. But even in those early days, there were whispers of trouble beneath the surface. Khalid had a way of controlling the narrative, steering every interaction toward his terms. If Sarah asked too many questions, he deflected with charm or changed the subject entirely. When she tried to bring up logistics, how they'd manage seeing each other amidst their busy schedules, he brushed it off. "Let's not overthink this," he'd say, his smile disarming but firm. "We'll figure it out as we go." And then came the warnings. Subtle at first, almost casual. "This stays between us," he told her during one of their evenings together, his tone light but pointed. "People misunderstand things. They gossip." At the time, it didn't seem alarming, just a reminder to keep their budding relationship discreet. But looking back, it was the first sign of the imbalance growing between them. Khalid called the shots, Sarah followed along, caught in the gravitational pull of his influence. As weeks turned into months, the cracks began to show. Missed appointments became a pattern. Text messages went unanswered for hours, sometimes days, only for Khalid to reappear as though nothing had happened. "I've been swamped with work," he'd explain, his apology polished and practiced. And Sarah, desperate to hold on to the magic of those early days, accepted his excuses without question. After all, this was Khalid al-Nasri, a man whose life moved at a pace few could keep up with. Wasn't it natural for him to slip up occasionally? But it wasn't just the missed moments, it was the way he spoke about their connection. "You're special, Sarah," he'd say, his words dripping with sincerity. "Not everyone understands what we have." Special. The word lingered in her mind long after their conversations ended, planting seeds of doubt about anyone outside their bubble. Slowly, Khalid began isolating her, not overtly, but in ways that felt almost accidental. Friends stopped inviting her out because she's always busy. Colleagues joked about her disappearing act after shifts. And Sarah, caught between two worlds, convinced herself it was worth it. Looking back now, it's easy to spot the red flags waving furiously in the distance. The vague explanations. The insistence on secrecy. The way Khalid controlled every aspect of their relationship while painting himself as a victim of circumstance. But in the moment, Sarah couldn't see them clearly, or maybe she didn't want to. Because as unsettling as some parts felt, there was still that glimmer of hope. The belief that maybe, just maybe, Khalid truly cared for her in a way no one else ever had. Of course, hope has a way of blinding us to danger. And in this case, the danger wasn't just lurking, it was closing in faster than either of them realized. Stay with me, because this is where the story takes its first real turn. We're peeling back layers now, revealing truths that aren't easy to face. Keep listening, keep engaging, and let's uncover the rest together. Don't forget, I'll be in the comments later, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this, they stick with you long after the details fade. As the weeks turned into months, the affair between Sarah and Khalid grew more intense, and more complicated. What had once felt like a whirlwind romance now carried an undercurrent of unease, though Sarah struggled to put her finger on why. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Khalid continued to shower her with attention, whisking her away to luxurious destinations and filling her life with experiences she'd only dreamed of. But beneath the glitz and glamour, the dynamic between them shifted in ways that left Sarah feeling increasingly uneasy. It wasn't just the secrecy anymore, though that was suffocating enough. Khalid became more insistent about keeping their relationship hidden, his tone sharper when he reminded her of the stakes. "You don't understand how people are," he'd say, his voice low but urgent. "They'll twist things, make assumptions. If word gets out—" He didn't finish the sentence, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. To Sarah, it sounded like concern at first, a man protecting what mattered to him. But over time, those warnings began to feel less like advice and more like threats. Khalid had a way of making her believe she was the one who needed to be careful, not him. "It's for your own good," he'd assure her, brushing off any hesitation she voiced. And Sarah, caught in the web he wove so skillfully, convinced herself that he was right. After all, hadn't she always been taught to tread carefully, to avoid drawing too much attention to herself? Wasn't discretion part of being an adult, especially in a world as judgmental as theirs? But even as she tried to rationalize his behavior, doubts crept in. There were moments when Khalid's charm slipped, revealing glimpses of something colder beneath. Like the time she accidentally mentioned their plans to a colleague, only to see his expression harden instantly. "Be careful who you talk to," he snapped later, his usual calm replaced by an edge she hadn't seen before. Or the night she arrived late to meet him, citing traffic delays, and found him pacing angrily outside the restaurant. "I thought we agreed on timing," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "You can't afford to be careless." Each incident chipped away at her confidence, leaving her unsure of what, or whom, to trust. Yet every time she considered stepping back, Khalid would pull her closer again, wrapping her in promises of adventure and devotion. "You're extraordinary, Sarah," he'd whisper, his words softening the edges of her doubt. "Not everyone gets to experience what we have." And just like that, she'd find herself convinced once more, not because she believed him completely, but because walking away felt harder than staying. The secrecy weighed on her more than she let on. Friends stopped asking why she canceled plans last minute. Colleagues whispered behind her back about her mysterious disappearances. Even her mother noticed something was off during one of their weekly calls. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, sensing the hesitation in Sarah's voice. "You sound distracted." Sarah forced a laugh, brushing it off as exhaustion from work. But inside, she felt the walls closing in, trapping her in a narrative she couldn't escape. And then came the physical symptoms, the ones she tried desperately to ignore. Fatigue settled over her like a fog, making even simple tasks feel exhausting. She chalked it up to stress, telling herself she was working too many shifts, sleeping too little, pushing herself too hard. The persistent sore throat and occasional fever? Probably just a bug she'd picked up from passengers on long-haul flights. When unexplained bruises appeared on her arms, she told herself it was clumsiness, nothing more. Anything to avoid confronting the growing unease in the pit of her stomach. Because admitting there was a problem meant facing questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions about Khalid. About the choices she'd made. About whether she'd misjudged him, or worse, ignored warning signs she should have seen. So instead of seeking answers, she buried herself deeper in denial, clinging to the hope that whatever was wrong would go away on its own. But deep down, she knew better. Somewhere in the quiet corners of her mind, the truth lingered, waiting for the moment she'd finally be brave enough to face it. We're getting closer now, to the moment when Sarah's world tilts irrevocably, forcing her to confront the reality she's been avoiding. Stay with me, because this is where the story takes its next chilling turn. Keep listening, keep questioning, and let's unravel the truth together. Remember, I'll be here in the comments, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this demand to be heard. Let's take a moment here because this is where the story pivots, where Sarah's life changes in ways she could never have anticipated. It's raw, it's painful, and it's real. These are the moments that stick with us long after the details fade, the kind of turning points that force someone to confront not just their circumstances but their very sense of self. So stay with me, because this is where the tragedy unfolds, and where the truth begins to surface. It started as a whisper, a nagging feeling in the back of her mind that something was deeply wrong. The fatigue had become relentless now, no longer something she could brush off as stress or overwork. Her body felt heavy, like it was carrying a weight she couldn't explain. Simple tasks left her drained, and there were days when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. She told herself it was temporary, that she just needed rest. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Then came the symptoms she couldn't ignore. Persistent fevers. Night sweats that soaked through her sheets. Unexplained weight loss that made her clothes hang loose on her frame. And those bruises. Dark, angry marks appearing without explanation, as though her body was betraying her from the inside out. For weeks, she tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was anemia. Maybe it was exhaustion catching up with her. Anything but the truth she feared most. Finally, desperation pushed her into a doctor's office. The visit itself was daunting enough. Sarah hated hospitals, avoided them whenever possible. But this time, she didn't have a choice. Sitting in the sterile exam room, surrounded by the faint smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights, she felt smaller than ever. When the doctor asked about her symptoms, she stumbled over her words, trying to piece together an explanation that made sense. By the time the blood tests were ordered, her anxiety had reached a fever pitch. The wait for results felt endless. Hours stretched into days, each one heavier than the last. When the call finally came, Sarah's heart sank before the doctor even spoke. "We need to talk," he said gently, his tone leaving no room for hope. She braced herself, clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then it hit her, the words that would change everything: "You've tested positive for HIV." In that moment, the world stopped spinning. The diagnosis hit her like a freight train, shattering every illusion she'd clung to. How could this be happening? She was careful. Always had been. Or so she thought. As the initial shock gave way to panic, questions swirled in her mind, chaotic and unrelenting. Who? When? Why? And then, like a cruel spotlight shining on a truth she tried to bury, Khalid's face appeared in her thoughts. At first, she pushed the suspicion aside. No, it couldn't be him. Could it? He was Khalid al-Nasri, a man who moved through life untouchable, invincible. Surely, he wouldn't. Would he? But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to deny. The missed appointments. The vague excuses. The way he controlled every aspect of their relationship, dictating when and where they met, always insisting on secrecy. It all pointed to something sinister lurking beneath the surface. Sarah spent hours replaying their encounters in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. Had he known? Was this why he'd warned her so insistently about discretion? The thought made her stomach churn. If he had known, if he'd deliberately exposed her, it meant something far worse than betrayal. It meant he saw her as expendable, disposable, a pawn in his game of power and control. Determined to confront him, she texted Khalid, asking to meet urgently. His response was immediate, almost too eager. Of course. Whatever you need. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, away from prying eyes. As Sarah sat waiting, her hands trembled around the coffee cup, her mind racing with what she would say. When Khalid arrived, his usual charm was intact, his smile warm and disarming. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched across his features. "You sounded upset." For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of what she was about to say pressing down on her chest. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she looked him in the eye and asked the question that had haunted her since the diagnosis. "Do you know anything about this?" Khalid's expression shifted instantly, his mask slipping just enough to reveal the coldness beneath. "About what?" he replied, his tone sharp, defensive. When she pressed further, accusing him outright of knowing, or worse, hiding, the truth, his demeanor changed completely. Gone was the charming billionaire who had swept her off her feet. In his place stood someone else entirely, calculating, intimidating, and utterly devoid of remorse. "You're making accusations you can't prove," he snapped, leaning closer, his voice low but laced with venom. "Think carefully before you say something you'll regret." It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. He went on to paint her as paranoid, unstable, someone whose career and reputation would crumble if she dared to speak out. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "To ruin your life over baseless claims?" By the time the meeting ended, Sarah felt hollow, her resolve shaken but not broken. Khalid's denial had been expected, but the intimidation tactics caught her off guard. She realized then that confronting him directly wasn't enough. He held all the cards, his wealth and influence shielding him from accountability. But walking away wasn't an option either. Not anymore. As she walked home that evening, the enormity of her situation settled over her like a storm cloud. How could someone so powerful act with such disregard for another human being? How could he justify exposing her to something so devastating and then dismiss it as though it were nothing? The anger burned hot within her, mingling with despair and fear. She wanted answers, justice, closure, but none of those things seemed possible in a world where men like Khalid operated above the law. And yet, even in her darkest moments, a spark of determination flickered to life. If Khalid thought he could silence her, he was wrong. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone else he might hurt if she stayed quiet. The road ahead would be long, fraught with risks and uncertainties. But Sarah knew one thing for certain, she couldn't let him win. "Stay with me, because this is where the fight truly begins. We're moving from tragedy to resilience, from victimhood to empowerment. Keep listening, keep engaging, and let's see how Sarah finds the strength to stand up against the impossible. Let's keep going, because this is where Sarah begins to take back control, a pivotal moment in her journey from victim to advocate. It's not easy, and it's certainly not without risk, but sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most powerful transformations. So stay with me, because this is where courage starts to outweigh fear." The days following her confrontation with Khalid were a blur of emotions, anger, despair, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Sarah felt like she was drowning, caught between the weight of her diagnosis and the suffocating reality of what Khalid had done. But even in her darkest moments, something inside her refused to give up. She couldn't let him erase her story, bury it beneath layers of privilege and power. Not without a fight. It was Layla who first noticed something was wrong. A fellow flight attendant and one of the few people Sarah still trusted, Layla had always been perceptive, quick to pick up on subtle changes in those around her. When Sarah started calling out sick more often, avoiding social gatherings, and retreating into herself, Layla knew better than to let it slide. "You're not okay," she said one evening after their shift ended, her tone gentle but firm. "Talk to me." At first, Sarah resisted. How could she put into words the storm raging inside her? The shame of the diagnosis, the betrayal by someone she trusted, the fear of what might happen if she spoke out? But Layla wasn't about to let her shoulder the burden alone. Over cups of tea in Sarah's small apartment, the truth finally spilled out, haltingly at first, then in a torrent of emotion. By the time Sarah finished recounting everything, tears streaming down her face, Layla sat stunned but resolute. "You can't stay silent," Layla said after a long pause, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "If you do, he wins. He gets away with it. All of it. And what happens when he does this to someone else? What happens when no one speaks up?" Her words struck a chord deep within Sarah, reigniting that flicker of determination she'd felt during her confrontation with Khalid. But speaking out wasn't as simple as finding the courage. It meant risking everything. Her career, her reputation, her safety, all of it hung precariously in the balance. And yet, Layla was right. Staying silent wasn't an option anymore. With Layla's help, Sarah began documenting everything. They started with text messages, the ones Khalid had sent during their relationship, filled with promises and affection now laced with irony. Then came emails, photos from outings they'd taken together, receipts from lavish dinners and trips. Every piece of evidence was meticulously collected, stored securely, and backed up multiple times. Layla encouraged Sarah to write down every detail she could remember. Dates, locations, conversations, anything that might help build a case against him. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. They needed witnesses too. Sarah reached out cautiously to a few colleagues who had noticed her frequent disappearances or overheard snippets of her interactions with Khalid. Some were hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation or simply unwilling to cross paths with someone as untouchable as him. Others, however, stepped forward, offering fragments of information that, while incomplete on their own, added critical context to Sarah's claims. As the pieces slowly came together, the obstacles became clearer and more daunting. Fear of retaliation loomed large. Khalid's reach extended far beyond what Sarah had initially realized. Friends warned her to tread carefully, reminding her of stories about others who had dared to challenge Dubai's elite only to vanish or be silenced permanently. Legal barriers compounded the issue. In a system designed to protect the powerful, proving wrongdoing often felt like an impossible task. Even societal norms worked against her, whispering that women like her shouldn't make waves, shouldn't rock the boat, shouldn't dare to demand justice. And yet, for every reason to stay quiet, there was another pushing her forward. What if she wasn't the first? What if she wouldn't be the last? The thought of other women suffering in silence fueled her resolve, driving her to push past the fear and doubt gnawing at the edges of her mind. The tension built steadily as Sarah weighed the risks. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Days blurred into each other, the weight of her decision pressing down harder with each passing hour. Could she really expose someone like Khalid? Would anyone believe her? And even if they did, would it make a difference? There were moments when the fear threatened to overwhelm her, when the enormity of what she was attempting felt insurmountable. But then she'd think about her mother, whose sacrifices had taught her the value of resilience. About her siblings, whose futures depended on her ability to rise above. About herself, the woman who had worked tirelessly to build a better life, only to have it torn apart by someone who saw her as expendable. In those moments, clarity emerged. This wasn't just about revenge or vindication, it was about accountability. About shining a light in the darkness and refusing to let power operate unchecked. Sarah knew the road ahead would be treacherous, fraught with uncertainty and danger. But she also knew one thing for certain. Staying silent wasn't living. It was surviving. And she deserved more than that. We're getting closer now, to the moment Sarah steps out of the shadows and into the spotlight, armed with nothing but the truth and her unyielding determination. Stay with me, because this is where the real battle begins. Keep listening, keep questioning, and let's see how far courage can take her. Remember, I'll be here in the comments, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this remind us that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear win. The decision to go public didn't come easily. For weeks, Sarah wrestled with the implications, weighing every possible outcome. She knew that once she stepped into the spotlight, there would be no turning back. The world would see her, not just as a victim but as someone willing to stand up against one of the most untouchable men in Dubai. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also liberating. Because for the first time since her diagnosis, she felt like she was taking control of her narrative instead of letting others dictate it for her. With Layla by her side, Sarah reached out to international media outlets, those beyond the reach of Khalid's influence. The pitch was simple yet devastating. A young woman, betrayed and exposed to a life-altering illness by a billionaire who believed himself above accountability. Journalists listened intently, their skepticism giving way to shock as they reviewed the evidence Sarah had painstakingly gathered. Text messages painted a picture of manipulation and deceit. Photos captured moments meant to remain hidden. Witness accounts added layers of credibility that couldn't be ignored. When the story broke, it sent shockwaves around the globe. Headlines blared with phrases like, "Dubai billionaire accused of transmitting HIV," and "Flight attendant breaks silence on secret affair." News anchors dissected every detail, their voices tinged with disbelief at the audacity of Khalid's alleged actions. Social media erupted, hashtags trending as people demanded answers, justice, and reform. Overnight, Sarah went from an unknown flight attendant to the face of a movement, a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic oppression. But with the attention came backlash. Almost immediately, Khalid's team sprang into action, spinning counter-narratives designed to discredit Sarah at every turn. They portrayed her as opportunistic, accusing her of fabricating the story for financial gain or fame. Friends of Khalid, some real, some planted, spoke out in his defense, describing him as a pillar of integrity unfairly targeted by baseless allegations. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, pressure mounted on witnesses who had initially supported Sarah. Some recanted their statements entirely, claiming they'd been coerced or misunderstood. Others simply disappeared, unreachable despite repeated attempts to contact them. Even worse, key pieces of evidence began vanishing without explanation. Emails once securely stored were suddenly corrupted. Receipts and documents went missing from locked files. It was as if invisible hands were erasing any trace of wrongdoing before the authorities could act. And speaking of authorities, their response was sluggish at best. While public outrage forced officials to announce an investigation, insiders whispered about political interference, pointing fingers at the very systems designed to protect the elite. "It's all for show," one source confided anonymously to a journalist. "They'll drag it out until the world forgets." For Sarah, watching the pushback unfold was like reliving her worst fears. Every accusation hurled at her felt like another blow, chipping away at her resolve. Yet amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. Public pressure mounted. People refused to let the story die. Advocacy groups rallied around Sarah, amplifying her voice and demanding transparency. Influencers used their platforms to share her journey, reminding followers that behind every headline was a human being fighting for dignity. Protesters took to the streets in cities worldwide, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah," and "Power must be held accountable." The sheer force of collective outrage forced authorities to take notice. What had started as a half-hearted investigation gained momentum, spurred on by mounting calls for accountability. Investigators reopened files, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed new leads, even if reluctantly. For the first time, Khalid's carefully constructed facade showed cracks. His name, once synonymous with success and respectability, became tarnished by association. Business partners distanced themselves publicly, fearing collateral damage. Friends stopped answering his calls, unsure whether loyalty was worth the risk. Through it all, Sarah remained steadfast, though the toll was evident. Sleepless nights turned into caffeine-fueled days as she navigated interviews, legal proceedings, and endless speculation. Supporters praised her bravery, calling her a hero. Detractors labeled her reckless, questioning why she hadn't spoken up sooner. Through both praise and criticism, she held on to one truth. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because staying silent would have cost her everything, and possibly others after her. As the investigation dragged on, the tension grew almost unbearable. Would justice prevail, or would Khalid slip through the cracks once again? Could Sarah's courage truly dismantle a system built to protect men like him? These questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. We're not done yet, not by a long shot. Stay with me, because this is where the battle reaches its climax. Keep listening, keep questioning, and let's see how far the ripple effects of one woman's bravery can spread. Remember, I'll be here in the comments, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this prove that even the smallest voice can spark monumental change. As the world watched Sarah's story unfold, something remarkable began to happen. Other women started coming forward. At first, it was just a trickle, a hesitant message here, an anonymous tip there, but soon, it grew into a flood. Women from different walks of life, united by their shared experience of exploitation at Khalid al-Nasri's hands, found the strength to speak out. Some had worked alongside Sarah in the aviation industry. Others had crossed paths with Khalid in entirely different settings. But their stories all carried the same chilling undertones: manipulation, coercion, and a blatant disregard for human dignity. One woman, a former hotel employee named Aisha, recounted how Khalid had offered her a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity early in her career. What began as professional mentorship quickly turned predatory, culminating in an affair she felt powerless to end. "He made me feel like I owed him," she explained during an emotional interview. "Like if I said no, my career would be over before it even started." Another woman, a business associate who had collaborated with Khalid on several projects, described how he used his influence to isolate her professionally and personally. "He controlled everything, the meetings, the deadlines, even who I could talk to," she said. "I didn't realize until later that I wasn't just working with him. I was trapped." These testimonies painted a devastating picture of a man who saw people not as individuals but as pawns in his game of power. Each story added another layer to the accusations against him, reinforcing what Sarah had known all along: she wasn't alone. For so many women, speaking out had seemed impossible, until now. Seeing Sarah stand up to someone as untouchable as Khalid gave them hope that maybe, just maybe, they could do the same. The emergence of these voices sparked a broader conversation about systemic issues within industries like aviation, where power imbalances often leave workers vulnerable. Flight attendants, pilots, ground staff, they all operate in environments where hierarchy reigns supreme and dissent is discouraged. Passengers expect perfection, companies demand compliance, and employees learn early on to prioritize invisibility over assertiveness. In such settings, figures like Khalid thrive. Their wealth and status grant them access to spaces others cannot enter, while their charm allows them to mask intentions behind polished smiles and empty promises. Advocacy groups seized the moment, using Sarah's case to shine a light on these systemic failures. Panels were organized, petitions circulated, and policies proposed, all aimed at creating safer workplaces for those most at risk. Industry leaders faced mounting pressure to address long-standing inequities, from inadequate reporting mechanisms to cultures of silence that protect predators. "This isn't just about one man," said a representative from a global flight attendants union during a press conference. "It's about dismantling the systems that enable abuse and ensuring no one has to endure what these women have endured." For Sarah, hearing these stories was both heartbreaking and empowering. On one hand, she grieved for the pain others had suffered, pain she understood intimately. On the other hand, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight was no longer just about holding Khalid accountable. It was about creating a future where such abuses couldn't happen in the first place. Every testimony shared, every policy changed, every voice raised, it was proof that her courage hadn't been in vain. Public support continued to grow, fueled by the sheer number of women stepping forward. Hashtags like #BreakTheSilence and #NoMorePredators trended globally, accompanied by personal stories from people across industries. Social media became a platform for solidarity, a space where survivors could connect and amplify each other's voices. Celebrities and influencers joined the cause, sharing resources and urging followers to educate themselves about power dynamics and consent. Even corporations, eager to distance themselves from scandal, pledged donations to organizations fighting workplace exploitation. Through it all, Sarah remained at the center of the storm, not as a victim, but as a leader. She gave interviews, participated in panel discussions, and collaborated with advocacy groups to push for meaningful change. It wasn't easy. The scrutiny never let up, and the emotional toll was immense. But she drew strength from the community forming around her, from knowing that her actions were inspiring others to take a stand. "I didn't choose this path," she said during one particularly poignant speech. "But I'm choosing to walk it. Because if my story helps even one person find their voice, then none of this will have been in vain." Hope began to take root amidst the outrage. Governments announced plans to review labor laws, promising stricter protections for workers in high-risk industries. Companies implemented new training programs focused on recognizing and preventing abuse. And slowly but surely, conversations that had once been whispered in private moved into the open, challenging the stigma surrounding victims of exploitation. We're getting closer now, to the moment when accountability meets action, when individual bravery transforms into collective progress. Stay with me, because this is where the story starts to shift from despair to determination. Keep listening, keep questioning, and let's see how far this movement can go. Remember, I'll be here in the comments, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this remind us that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when enough people refuse to stay silent. For all the headlines, protests, and global outrage, justice proved elusive. Despite the mounting evidence and testimonies from other victims, formal charges against Khalid al-Nasri were never filed. Investigators cited lack of conclusive proof, procedural hurdles, and insufficient grounds to move forward, phrases that fell hollow given the weight of what had been uncovered. Behind closed doors, rumors swirled about backroom deals and political maneuvering, whispers of wealth buying silence yet again. To the outside world, it seemed like another case of power prevailing over truth. Khalid, ever the master manipulator, seized the opportunity to rewrite his narrative. In carefully orchestrated interviews, he denied every allegation, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. "I've dedicated my life to building businesses, creating jobs, and supporting my community," he declared during one televised appearance, his tone calm but firm. "These accusations are not just false, they're damaging. They tarnish reputations and destroy lives." His words carried the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deflection, and for many, they rang hollow. But for others, the skeptics, the undecided, they planted seeds of doubt. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself grappling with the fallout. The emotional toll was relentless. Nights blurred into days as she replayed the events in her mind, questioning whether she could have done more, said more, fought harder. The physical scars remained too, a daily reminder of the illness she now lived with, one that would shape her future in ways she was still learning to navigate. Doctors assured her that with proper care, she could lead a full life, but the diagnosis lingered like a shadow, coloring every decision, every plan, every hope. Rebuilding her life felt daunting, almost insurmountable at times. Friends tried to offer support, but few truly understood the depth of what she'd endured. Some drifted away, unable or unwilling to sit with the heaviness of her pain. Others stayed close, reminding her that she wasn't alone, even when it felt like she was. Her family, especially her mother, became her anchor. "You've always been strong," her mother told her one evening, holding her hand tightly. "This doesn't change who you are. It just shows how much stronger you can be." Amidst the struggle, Sarah found solace in activism. What had started as a personal fight for accountability evolved into something larger, a mission to protect others from suffering the same fate. She partnered with advocacy groups, using her platform to push for stronger protections for vulnerable workers. From lobbying for policy changes to speaking at conferences about workplace safety, she poured her energy into creating a world where silence wasn't the only option. Each victory, no matter how small, reignited a spark within her, a reminder that progress was possible, even if imperfect. Her work didn't go unnoticed. Media outlets hailed her as a champion for change, highlighting her efforts to reform industries long plagued by inequity. Awards followed, recognition for her courage and resilience, but Sarah accepted them with humility, always redirecting the focus to those still fighting. "This isn't about me," she said during one acceptance speech, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "It's about everyone who's been told their voice doesn't matter. Together, we're proving that it does." Still, there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Late at night, when the noise of the day faded and the quiet settled in, doubts crept back in. Had it been worth it? Would anything really change, or was she simply shouting into the void? These questions haunted her, lingering like ghosts she couldn't quite banish. But then she'd think about the messages she received daily, from women thanking her for giving them the courage to speak up, from allies pledging to do better, from strangers moved to action by her story, and she'd find her footing again. Justice may have been deferred, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Khalid's reputation, once gleaming and untouchable, bore cracks that refused to fade completely. Business partners distanced themselves, wary of association. Social circles shrank as acquaintances grew cautious. Even his own family began to distance themselves publicly, eager to avoid collateral damage. While he continued to operate behind the scenes, his aura of invincibility had dimmed, proof that even the most powerful figures aren't immune to consequence. For Sarah, this partial victory was bittersweet. She knew the system hadn't been dismantled, it had merely shifted slightly, leaving room for future battles. But she also knew that change rarely came overnight. Every step forward mattered, no matter how incremental. And so, she kept moving, kept pushing, kept believing that the arc of justice might bend toward truth if enough people pulled together. We're nearing the end now. Not of the journey, but of this chapter. Stay with me, because this is where reflection meets resolution. Keep listening, keep questioning, and let's see how Sarah's story leaves an indelible mark on the world. Remember, I'll be here in the comments, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this remind us that resilience isn't the absence of pain, it's the refusal to let pain define us. Let's pause here, not to wrap things up neatly, but to reflect on what this story reveals about power, privilege, and the systems that shape our world. Because Sarah's journey isn't just her own, it's a mirror reflecting truths many of us would rather look away from. Stick with me because this is where we ask the hard questions, the ones that linger long after the headlines fade. Privilege has a way of shielding those who wield it, creating an invisible armor that deflects accountability at every turn. Khalid al-Nasri wasn't untouchable because he was extraordinary. He was untouchable because the system was built to protect people like him. Wealth buys influence, influence buys silence, and silence perpetuates cycles of exploitation. It's a pattern as old as time, yet somehow still shocking when laid bare. For Sarah, and for countless others like her, this reality meant navigating a world where speaking out carried risks far greater than staying silent. But silence comes at its own cost. It allows predators to operate unchecked, emboldened by the knowledge that they'll likely never face consequences. The aviation industry, in particular, serves as a microcosm of these dynamics. Flight attendants, pilots, ground staff, they're expected to deliver perfection while remaining invisible. Passengers demand service with a smile, companies prioritize profit over protection, and employees learn early on that dissent often means dismissal. In such environments, figures like Khalid thrive. Their status grants them access to spaces others can't enter, while their charm masks intentions behind polished smiles and empty promises. The result? A culture where abuse festers, hidden beneath layers of hierarchy and fear. But Sarah's story forces us to confront these truths head-on. It challenges us to examine not just individual actions, but the broader systems that enable them. What responsibility do we bear in holding the powerful accountable? Are we complicit when we stay silent, or do we have a duty to speak up, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it seems futile? These aren't easy questions, nor are they ones with simple answers. But asking them is the first step toward change. And then there's the question of prevention. How do we create systems that protect the vulnerable instead of enabling abuse? Policies matter, yes, but so does culture. We need workplaces where reporting mechanisms are accessible and trusted, where survivors are believed instead of dismissed, where power imbalances are acknowledged and addressed. This requires more than lip service. It demands action. It means holding leaders accountable, amplifying marginalized voices, and refusing to let convenience outweigh justice. Sarah's courage reminds us that accountability starts with visibility. By stepping into the spotlight, she forced the world to see what had been hidden for too long. Her story didn't just expose one man's wrongdoing, it exposed flaws in the very fabric of our society. And now, armed with that knowledge, we have a choice. Do we let the moment pass, or do we use it to drive meaningful change? If there's one thing Sarah's journey teaches us, it's this: courage is contagious. One voice can spark a movement, One story can inspire a reckoning, and one act of bravery can remind us all that no one should face injustice alone. So now, I'm asking you to carry this story forward, to share it, to talk about it, to ensure it doesn't end here. Share Sarah's story, not because it's sensational, but because it's real. Share it to honor the resilience of survivors everywhere. Support advocacy groups working tirelessly to protect vulnerable workers and dismantle systems of exploitation. Educate yourself and others about power dynamics, consent, and the importance of believing survivors. Every action matters, no matter how small. Together, we can build a future where stories like Sarah's become less common, not because they're silenced, but because they're prevented. I'll be here in the comments, ready to engage with your thoughts, theories, and reflections. Did Sarah's story resonate with you? What lessons will you take away? How will you contribute to creating a safer, fairer world? Let's keep the conversation going, because stories like this don't exist in isolation. They spark dialogue, inspire action, and demand accountability. As we close this chapter, let me leave you with this. Even in the face of injustice, courage and resilience can inspire lasting change. Sarah may not have received the justice she deserved, but her fight wasn't in vain. She reminded us that progress begins with visibility, that hope thrives on determination, and that no amount of power can extinguish the light of truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Keep listening, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep acting. Because together, we can ensure that stories like Sarah's lead to something greater, a world where everyone has a voice, and where no one is left behind.